Daylight's coming to civilization had not improved him. True, he wore better clothes. He learned slightly better manners and spoke better English. As a gambler and a man-trampler, he had developed remarkable efficiency. Also, he had become used to a higher standard of living, and he had whetted his wits to razor sharpness in the fierce, complicated struggle of fighting males. But he had hardened, and at the expense of his old-time, whole-souled geniality. Of the essential refinements of civilization he knew nothing. He did not know they existed. He had become cynical, bitter, and brutal. Power had its effect on him that it had on all men. Suspicious of the big exploiters, despising the fools of the exploited herd, he had faith only in himself. This led to an undue and erroneous exaltation of his ego, while kindly considerations of others, nay, even simple respect, was destroyed, until naught was left for him but to worship at the shrine of self. Physically, he was not the man of iron muscles who had come down out of the Arctic. He did not exercise sufficiently, ate more than was good for him, and drank altogether too much. His muscles were getting flabby, and his tailor called attention to his increasing waistband. In fact, Daylight was developing a definite paunch. This physical deterioration was manifest likewise in his face. The lean Indian visage was suffering a city change. The slight hollows in the cheeks under the high cheekbones had filled out. The beginning of puff sacks under the eyes was faintly visible. The girth of the neck had increased, and the first crease and fold of a double chin were becoming plainly discernible. The old effect of asceticism, bred of terrific hardships and toil, had vanished. The features had become broader and heavier, betraying all the stigmata of the life he lived, advertising the man's self-indulgence, harshness, and brutality. Even his human affiliations were descending. Playing a lone hand, contemptuous of most of the men with whom he played, lacking in sympathy or understanding of them, and certainly independent of them, he had found little in common with those to be encountered, say, at the Alta Pacific. In point of fact, when the battle with the steamship companies was at its height, and his raiding was inflicting incalculable damage on all business interests, he had been asked to resign from the Alta Pacific. The idea had been rather to his liking, and he found new quarters in clubs like the Riverside, organized and practically maintained by the city bosses. He found that he really liked such men better. They were more primitive and simple, and they did not put on airs. They were honest buccaneers, frankly in the game for what they could get out of it. On the surface, more raw and savage, but at least not glossed over with oily or graceful hypocrisy. The Alta Pacific had suggested that his resignation be kept a private matter, and then had privily informed the newspapers. The latter had made great capital out of the forced resignation, but Daylight had grinned and silently gone his way, though registering a black mark against more than one club member, who was destined to feel, in the days to come, the crushing weight of the Klondikers' financial paw. The storm center of a combined newspaper attack lasting for months. Daylight's character had been torn to shreds. There was no fact in his history that had not been distorted into a criminality or a vice. This public making of him over into an iniquitous monster had pretty well crushed any lingering hope that he had of getting acquainted with Dede Mason. He felt that there was no chance for her ever to look kindly on a man of his caliber, and beyond increasing her salary to $75 a month, he proceeded gradually to forget about her. The increase was made known to her through Morrison, and later she thanked Daylight, and that was the end of it. One weekend, feeling heavy and depressed, and tired of the city and its ways, he obeyed the impulse of a whim that was later to play an important part in his life. The desire to get out of the city for a whiff of country air and for a change of scene was the cause. Yet to him he made the excuse of going to Glen Ellen for the purpose of inspecting the brickyard with which Holdsworthy had gold-bricked him. He spent the night in the little country hotel, and on Sunday morning, astride a saddle horse rented from the Glen Ellen butcher, rode out of the village. The brickyard was close at hand on the flat beside the Sonoma Creek. The kilns were visible among the trees, and when he glanced to the left and caught sight of a cluster of wooded knolls half a mile away, perched on the rolling slopes of Sonoma Mountain, the mountain itself, wooded, towered behind him. The trees on the knolls seemed to beckon to him. The dry, early summer air, shot through with sunshine, was wine to him. Unconsciously he drank it in deep breaths. The prospect of the brickyard was uninviting. He was jaded with all things business, and the wooded knolls were calling to him. A horse was between his legs, a good horse, he decided, one that sent him back to the cayuses he had ridden during his eastern Oregon boyhood. He had been somewhat of a rider in those early days, and the champ of bit and creak of saddle leather sounded good to him now. Resolving to have his fun first and to look over the brickyard afterward, he rode on up the hill, prospecting for a way across country to get to the knolls. He left the country road at the first gate he came to, and cantered through a hayfield. The grain was waist high on either side the wagon road, and he sniffed the warm aroma of it with delighted nostrils. Larks flew up before him, and from everywhere came mellow notes. From the appearance of the road, it was patent that it had been used for hauling clay to the now idle brickyard. Salving his conscience with the idea that this was part of the inspection, he rode on to the clay pit, a huge scar in a hillside. But he did not linger long, swinging off again to the left and leaving the road. Not a farmhouse was in sight, and the change from city crowding was essentially satisfying. He rode now through open woods, across little flower-scattered glades, till he came upon a spring. Flat on the ground, he drank deeply of the clear water, and looking about him, felt with a shock the beauty of the world. It came to him like a discovery. He had never realized it before, he concluded, and also he had forgotten much. One could not sit in at high finance and keep track of such things. As he drank in the air, the scene, and the distant song of larks, he felt like a poker player rising from a night-long table and coming forth from the pent atmosphere to taste the freshness of the morn. At the base of the knolls he encountered a tumbled-down stake and rider fence. From the look of it, he judged it must be 40 years old at least, the work of some first pioneer who had taken up the land when the days of gold had ended. The woods were very thick here, yet fairly clear of underbrush, so that, while the blue sky was screened by the arched branches, he was able to ride beneath. He now found himself in a nook of several acres, where the oak and manzanita and madrono gave way to clusters of stately redwoods. Against the foot of a steep-sloped knoll, he came upon a magnificent group of redwoods that seemed to have gathered about a tiny, gurgling spring. He halted his horse, for beside the spring uprose a wild California lily. It was a wonderful flower, growing there in the cathedral nave of lofty trees. At least 8 feet in height, its stem rose straight and slender, green and bare, for 2/3 of its length, and then burst into a shower of snow-white waxen bells. There were hundreds of these blossoms, all from the one stem, delicately poised and ethereally frail. Daylight had never seen anything like it. Slowly his gaze wandered from it to all that was about him. He took off his hat with almost a vague religious feeling. This was different. No room for contempt and evil here. This was clean and fresh and beautiful, something he could respect. It was like a church. The atmosphere was one of holy calm. Here man felt the prompting of nobler things. Much of this and more was in Daylight's heart as he looked about him, but it was not a concept of his mind. He nearly felt it without thinking about it at all. On the steep incline above the spring grew tiny maidenhair ferns, while higher up were larger ferns and brakes. Great moss-covered trunks of fallen trees lay here and there, slowly sinking back and merging into the level of the forest mold. Beyond, in a slightly clearer space, wild grape and honeysuckle swung in green riot from gnarled old oak trees. A gray Douglas squirrel crept out on a branch and watched him. From somewhere came the distant knocking of a woodpecker. This sound did not disturb the hush and awe of the place. Quiet woods. Noise belonged there and made the solitude complete. The tiny, bubbling ripple of the spring and the gray flash of tree squirrel was yardsticks with which to measure the silence and motionless repose. "Might be a million miles from anywhere," Daylight whispered to himself. But ever his gaze returned to the wonderful lily beside the bubbling spring. He tethered the horse and wandered on foot among the knolls. Their tops were crowned with century-old spruce trees, and their sides clothed with oaks and madronos and native holly. But to the perfect redwoods belonged the small but deep cañon that threaded its way among the knolls. Here he found no passage out for his horse, and he returned to the lily beside the spring. On foot, tripping, stumbling, leading the animal, he forced his way up the hillside, and ever the ferns carpeted the way of his feet, ever the forest climbed with him and arched overhead, and ever the clean joy and sweetness stole in upon his senses. On the crest he came through an amazing thicket of velvet-trunked young madronos, and emerged on an open hillside that led down into a tiny valley. The sunshine was at first dazzling in its brightness, and he paused and rested, for he was panting from the exertion. Not of old had he known shortness of breath such as this, and muscles that so easily tired at a stiff climb. A tiny stream ran down the tiny valley through a tiny meadow that was carpeted knee-high with grass and blue and white nemophilia. The hillside was covered with Mariposa lilies and wild hyacinth, down and through which his horse dropped slowly, with circumspect feet and reluctant gait. Crossing the stream, Daylight followed a faint cattle trail over a low, rocky hill and through a wine-wooded forest of manzanita, and emerged upon another tiny valley, down which filtered another spring-fed, meadow-bordered streamlet. A jackrabbit bounded from a bush under his horse's nose, leaped the stream, and vanished up the opposite hillside of scrub oak. Daylight watched it admiringly as he rode on to the head of the meadow. Here he started up a many-pronged buck that seemed to soar across the meadow and to soar over the stake and rider fence, and still soaring, disappeared in a friendly copse beyond. Daylight's delight was unbounded. It seemed to him that he had never been so happy. His old woods training was aroused, and he was keenly interested in everything in the moss on the trees and branches, in the bunches of mistletoe hanging in the oaks, in the nest of a wood rat, in the watercress growing in the sheltered eddies of the little stream, in the butterflies drifting through the rifted sunshine and shadow, in the blue jays that flashed in splashes of gorgeous color across the forest aisles, in the tiny birds like wrens that hopped among the bushes and imitated certain minor quail calls, and in the crimson-crested woodpecker that ceased its knocking and cocked its head on one side to survey him. Crossing the stream, he struck faint vestiges of a wood road, used evidently a generation back, when the meadow had been cleared of its oaks. He found a hawk's nest on the lightning-shattered tipmost of a 6-foot redwood, and to complete it all his horse stumbled upon several large broods of half-grown quail, and the air was filled with the thrum of their flight. He halted and watched the young ones petrifying and disappearing on the ground before his eyes, and listening to the anxious calls of the old ones hidden in the thickets. "It sure beats country places and bungalows at Menlo Park," he communed aloud. "And if I ever get the hankering for country life, it's me for this every time." The old wood road led him to a clearing where a dozen acres of grapes grew on wine-red soil. A cow path, more trees and thickets, and he dropped down a hillside to the southeast exposure. Here, poised above a big forested cañon and looking out upon Sonoma Valley, was a small farmhouse. With its barn and outhouses, it snuggled into a nook in the hillside, which protected it from west and north. It was the erosion from the hillside, he judged, that had formed the little level stretch of vegetable garden. The soil was fat and black, and there was water in plenty, for he saw several faucets running wide open. Forgotten was the brickyard. Nobody was at home, but Daylight dismounted and ranged the vegetable garden, eating strawberries and green peas, inspecting the old adobe barn and the rusty plow and harrow, and rolling and smoking cigarettes while he watched the antics of several broods of young chickens and the mother hens. A foot trail that led down the wall of the big cañon invited him, and he proceeded to follow it. A water pipe, usually above ground, paralleled the trail, which he concluded led upstream to the bed of the creek. The wall of the cañon was several hundred feet from top to bottom, and magnificent were the untouched trees that the place was plunged in perpetual shade. He measured with his eye spruces 5 and 6 feet in diameter and redwoods even larger. One such he passed, a twister that was at least 10 or 11 feet through. The trail led straight to a small dam, where was the intake for the pipe that watered the vegetable garden. Here beside the stream were alders and laurel trees, and he walked through fern brakes higher than his head. Velvety moss was everywhere, out of which grew maidenhair and goldback ferns. Save for the dam, it was virgin wild. No axe had invaded, and the trees died only of old age and stress of winter storm. The huge trunks of those that had fallen lay moss-covered, slowly resolving back into the soil from which they sprang. Some had laid so long that they were quite gone, though their faint outlines, level with the mold, could still be seen. Others bridged the stream, and from beneath the bulk of one monster, half a dozen young trees, overthrown and crushed by the fall, growing out along the ground, still lived and prospered, their roots bathed by the stream, their upshooting branches catching the sunlight through the gap that had been made in the forest roof. Back at the farmhouse, Daylight mounted and rode away from the ranch and into the wilder cañons and steeper steeps beyond. Nothing could satisfy his holiday spirit now but the ascent of Sonoma Mountain. And here on the crest, 3 hours afterward, he emerged, tired and sweaty, garments torn, and face and hands scratched, but with sparkling eyes and an unwonted zestfulness of expression. He felt the illicit pleasure of a schoolboy playing truant. The big gambling table of San Francisco seemed very far away. But there was more than illicit pleasure in his mood. It was as though he were going through a sort of cleansing bath. No room here for all the sordidness, meanness, and viciousness that filled the dirty pool of city existence. Without pondering in detail upon the matter at all, his sensations were of purification and uplift. Had he been asked to state how he felt, he would merely have said that he was having a good time, for he was unaware in his self-consciousness of the potent charm of nature that was percolating through his city-rotted body and brain, potent in that he came from an abysmal past of wilderness dwellers, while he himself coated with but the thinnest rind of crowded civilization. There were no houses in the summit of Sonoma Mountain, and, all alone under the azure California sky, he reined in on the southern edge of the peak. He saw open pasture country, intersected with wooded cañons, descending to the south and west from his feet, crease on crease and roll on roll, from lower level to lower level, to the floor of the Petaluma Valley, flat as a billiard table, a cardboard affair, all patches and squares of geometrical regularity where the fat freeholds were farmed. Beyond, to the west, rose range on range of mountains cuddling purple mists of atmosphere in their valleys. And still beyond, over the last range of all, he saw the silver sheen of the Pacific. Swinging his horse, he surveyed the west and north, from Santa Rosa to St. Helena, and on to the east, across Sonoma to the chaparral-covered range that shut off the view of Napa Valley. Here, part way up the eastern wall of Sonoma Valley, in range of a line intersecting the little village of Glen Ellen, he made out a scar upon a hillside. His first thought was that it was a dump of a mine tunnel, but remembering that he was not in gold-bearing country, he dismissed the scar from his mind and continued the circle of his survey to the southeast, where across the waters of San Pablo Bay he could see, sharp and distant, the twin peaks of Mount Diablo. To the south was Mount Tamalpais, and yes, he was right. 50 miles away, where the drafty winds of the Pacific blew in the Golden Gate, the smoke of San Francisco made a low-lying haze against the sky. I ain't seen so much country all at once in many a day, he thought aloud. He was loath to depart, and it was not for an hour that he was able to tear himself away and take the descent of the mountain. Working out a new route just for the fun of it, late afternoon was upon him when he arrived back at the wooded knolls. Here on the top of them his keen eyes caught a glimpse of a shade of green sharply differentiated from any he had seen all day. Studying it for a minute, he concluded that it was composed of 3 cypress trees, and he knew that nothing else than the hand of man could have planted them there. Impelled by curiosity purely boyish, he made up his mind to investigate. So densely wooded was the knoll and so steep that he had to dismount and go up on foot, at times even on hands and knees, struggling hard to force a way through the thicker underbrush. He came out abruptly upon the cypresses. They were enclosed in a small square of ancient fence. The pickets, he could plainly see, had been hewn and sharpened by hand. Inside were the mounds of two children's graves. Two wooden headboards, likewise hand hewn, told the date: little David, born 1855, died 1859, and little Roy, born 1853, died 1860. "The poor little kids," Daylight muttered. The graves showed signs of recent care. Withered bouquets of wild flowers were on the mounds, and the lettering on the headboards was freshly painted. Guided by these clues, Daylight cast about for a trail, and found one leading down the side opposite to his ascent. Circling the base of the knoll, he picked up with his horse and rode on to the farmhouse. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and he was quickly in conversation with a nervous, slender young man who, he learned, was only a tenant on the ranch. How large was it? A matter of 180 acres, though it seemed much larger. This was because it was so irregularly shaped. Yes, it included the clay pit and all the knolls, and its boundary that ran along the big cañons was over a mile long. "You see," the young man said, "it was so rough and broken that when they began to farm this country, the farmers bought in the good land to the edge of it. That's why its boundaries are all gouged and jagged." "Oh, yes, he and his wife managed to scratch a living without working too hard. They didn't have to pay much rent. Hillard, the owner, depended upon the income from the clay pit. Hillard was well off and had big ranches and vineyards down on the flat of the valley. The brickyard paid 10 cents a cubic yard for the clay. As for the rest of the ranch, the land was good in patches where it was cleared, like the vegetable garden and the vineyard, but the rest of it was too much up and down. "You're not a farmer," Daylight said. The young man laughed and shook his head. "No, I'm a telegraph operator. But the wife and I decided to take a 2 years' vacation, and here we are. But the time's about up. I'm going back into the office this fall, after I get the grapes off." Yes, there were about 11 acres in the vineyard, wine grapes. The price was usually good. He grew most of what they ate. If he owned the place, he'd clear a patch of land on the side hill above the vineyard and plant a small home orchard. The soil was good. There was plenty of pasturage all over the ranch, and there were several cleared patches, amounting to about 15 acres in all, where he grew as much mountain hay as could be found. It sold for $3 to $5 more a ton than the rank stalked valley hay. Daylight listened. There came to him a sudden envy of this young fellow, living right in the midst of all this which Daylight had traveled through the last few hours. "What in thunder are you going back to the telegraph office for?" he demanded. The young man smiled with a certain wistfulness. "Because we can't get ahead here." He hesitated an instant. "And because there are added expenses coming. The rent, small as it is, counts, and besides, I'm not strong enough to effectually farm the place. If I owned it, or if I were a real husky like you, I'd ask nothing better, nor would the wife." Again the wistful smile hovered on his face. "You see, we're country born, and after bucking with cities for a few years, we kind of feel we like the country best. We plan to get ahead, though, and then some day we'll buy a patch of land and stay with it." The graves of the children? Yes, he had relettered them and hoed the weeds out. It had become the custom. Whoever lived on the ranch did that. For years, the story ran, the father and mother had returned each summer to the graves. But there had come a time when they came no more, and then old Hilliard started the custom. The scar across the valley? An old mine. It had never paid. The men had worked on it, off and on, for years, for the indications had been good. But that was years and years ago. No paying mine had ever been struck in the valley, though there had been no end of prospect holes put down, and there had been sort of a rush there 30 years back. A frail-looking young woman came to the door to call the man to supper. Daylight's first thought was that city living had not agreed with her, and then he noted the slight tan and healthy glow that seemed added to her face, and he decided that the country was the place for her. Declining an invitation to supper, he rode on for Glen Ellen, sitting slack-kneed in the saddle and softly humming forgotten songs. He dropped down the rough, winding road through covered pasture, with here and there thickets of manzanita and vistas of open glades. He listened greedily to the quail calling, and laughed outright once in sheer joy at a tiny chipmunk that fled scolding up a bank, slipping on the crumbly surface and falling down, then dashing across the road under his horse's nose, and, still scolding, scrabbling up a protecting oak. Daylight could not persuade himself to keep to the traveled roads that day, and another cut across country to Glen Ellen brought him upon a cañon that so blocked his way that he was glad to follow a friendly cow path. This led him to a small frame cabin. The doors and windows were open, and a cat was nursing a litter of kittens in the doorway, but no one seemed at home. He descended the trail that evidently crossed the cañon. Part way down, he met an old man coming up through the sunset. In his hand he carried a pail of foamy milk. He wore no hat, and in his face, framed with snow-white hair and beard, was the ruddy glow of content of the passing summer day. Daylight thought he had never seen so contented-looking a being. "How old are you, Daddy?" he queried. 84 was the reply. "Yes, sirree, 84, and sprier than most." "You must have taken good care of yourself," Daylight suggested. "I don't know about that. I ain't loafed none. I walked across the plains with an ox team and fought Indians in '51. And I was a family man then, with 7 youngsters. I reckon I was as old then as you are now, or pretty nigh on to it." "Don't you find it lonely here?" The old man shifted the pail of milk and reflected. "That all depends," he said oracularly. "I ain't never been lonely except when the old wife died. Some fellows are lonely in a crowd, and I'm one of them. That's the only time I'm lonely is when I go to Frisco. But I don't go no more, thank you, most to death. This is good enough for me. I've been right here in this valley since '54, one of the first settlers after the Spaniards." Daylight started his horse, saying, "Well, good night, Daddy. Stick with it. You got all the young bloods skinned, and I guess you sure buried a mighty sight of them." The old man chuckled, and Daylight rode on, singularly at peace with himself and all the world. It seemed that the old contentment of trail and camp he had known on the Yukon had come back to him. He could not shake from his eyes the picture of the old pioneer coming up the trail through the sunset light. He was certainly going some for '84. The thought of following his example entered Daylight's mind, but the big game of San Francisco vetoed the idea. "Well, anyway," he decided, "when I get old and quit the game, I'll settle down in a place something like this, and the city can go to hell." End of Part 2, Chapter 8.